He told me if I ever had nowhere else to go, I should bring this here. She was 20 years old alone and dragging a motorcycle chain across the floor of a biker bar filled with 300 Hells Angels. Every single head turned, every single voice went quiet. And in that silence, the only sound in the entire Iron Horse Tavern was the slow, heavy scrape of iron links against old wood. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Marcus Stone Callahan turned 55, he told himself he was done being surprised by anything. 30 years in the Hells Angels had a way of burning the shock clean out of a man. He had seen things that would make ordinary people lose sleep for the rest of their lives. He had buried brothers, fought battles that never made any newspaper, and carried loyalties that most people couldn't understand, even if he tried to explain them. And he had sat in that same corner booth at Iron Horse Tavern for more Saturday nights than he could count, and every single one of them had started and ended the same way. Loud, familiar, predictable. Brotherhood doing what brotherhood does. That was the night he stopped believing predictable was permanent. It was late October, the kind of Arizona night that still held summer's heat long past sundown. The parking lot outside Iron Horse was packed tighter than Marcus had seen it in months. Word had gone out that Rattlesnake Pete was making one of his rare visits from the Nevada chapter. And whenever Pete showed up, people came from 3 states in every direction. The bar was shoulder to shoulder, leather jackets touching leather jackets, the whole place smelling like motor oil, cigarette smoke, and cold beer. Somebody had the jukebox cranked loud enough that you could feel the bass in your sternum. Conversations were happening in groups of 6 and 8 and 10, and the laughter coming from the far corner where the older members had settled in was the kind of deep, unreserved laughter that only comes from men who have been through something real together. Marcus was not laughing. He was watching. That was always his role, and he had accepted it long ago. While others talked, he observed. While others drank, he noticed. It was why the chapter had voted him president, and it was why nobody had ever seriously challenged that vote in 12 years. He sat with his beer in front of him and his back to the wall, and he let the room move around him the way a river moves around a stone that has been sitting in the same spot for decades. Hector Hatchet Reyes slid into the seat across from him, which was the signal Marcus had been waiting for. Hector was his sergeant-at-arms, a compact, powerful man in his late 40s with a reputation for precision and very little patience for wasted words. "Pete's in a good mood," Hector said. "Pete's always in a good mood until he isn't," Marcus replied. "What's the word from Tucson?" "The situation with the warehouse is settled. Our guys came to an agreement." "An agreement that holds, one that holds," Hector confirmed. Marcus nodded. He lifted his beer, took a slow drink, and set it back down. "Good, that's been hanging over us too long." "My thoughts exactly." The jukebox shifted from one song to the next. Someone near the pool tables let out a whoop of celebration. The room felt full in the way Marcus liked it to feel, full of life, full of people who actually meant something to each other, full of the kind of noise that reminded him why he had chosen this life. And then the front door opened. I didn't hear it open. He couldn't have heard anything over the music and the voices and the laughter. But Marcus Stone Callahan felt the change in the room before he saw it, the way a man with 30 years of reading crowds can feel a shift in the air even before his eyes find the source. Something altered. Something pulled at his attention like a hook catching on fabric. He looked up from his beer. She was standing in the doorway. The first thing Marcus registered was that she was young. Young in a way that made her look fragile in that room, which was impressive because almost nothing looked fragile inside Iron Horse. 20 years old, maybe, if she was being generous about it. Blonde hair that was tangled and wind-chapped from a long drive, and not a little bit of desert dust. She was wearing jeans and a plain gray shirt and the kind of boots that had been walked in hard and recently. Her eyes moved around the room with a quality that Marcus recognized from his first year in the club, the specific alertness of a person who was trying to look calm and failing, whose instincts were screaming at them to run even as their will held them in place. People near the door started noticing her. The conversations closest to the entrance began fading, and then someone saw what she was carrying. Marcus heard the change before he saw her clearly. The laughter stopped first, then the conversation, and the silence moved through the room, like a wave rolling towards shore, spreading outward from the door in every direction. The jukebox kept playing because nobody had touched it yet, but within 15 seconds, it was the only sound in the entire bar. Every face had turned, 300 men with decades of hard living between them, all staring at the same 20-year-old girl. She was dragging something behind her. A chain, a heavy old motorcycle chain, the kind used to lock bikes in the early days, before electronic security systems, thick iron links, dark with age. The chain scraped across the wooden floor with each step she took, a slow metallic drag that in the sudden silence sounded louder than any voice in the room. She was pulling it with her left hand, gripping it near the top, and it trailed behind her, and at the end of it there was something else. A vest, an old black leather vest being dragged across the floor like a flag that had been brought down from a pole. And on that vest, visible from 20 feet away, because the patches had been sewn with care and maintained with reverence, there were markings that every man in that room recognized. It was a Hell's Angels vest, an original, older style, the kind worn a decade ago and more. And in the center of it, above the patches and the chapter mark, there was a name tag. Marcus was out of his seat before he fully knew he had decided to stand. Hector moved too, but Marcus was faster, crossing the bar with a directness that made the crowd part around him without anyone having to be asked. He needed to see the name on that vest. He needed to see it clearly, and he needed to see it now because something in his chest had already started telling him what it was going to say, and he needed to know whether his chest was right or whether 30 years had finally made him imagine things. He stopped 3 feet from the girl. She looked up at him, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Up close, she was even younger than she had appeared from across the room, and the exhaustion in her face was not the tiredness of a long drive. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of tired that had been accumulating for years, the exhaustion of someone who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had not had anyone to help her hold it. Marcus looked down at the phantom. The name said Ghost, Ethan Walker. Ghost. The sound that left Marcus's throat was not quite a word. It was something older than words, something that had been sitting at the bottom of his chest for 5 years. Hector, who had come to stand beside him, went completely still. The girl watched Marcus's face and said quietly, "You knew him." It was not a question. "Yeah," Marcus said. His voice came out different than he expected, rough in places that were usually smooth. "I knew him." "My name is Emily Walker," she said. The room that had been silent became more silent somehow, which shouldn't have been possible but was. "Ethan Walker was my father." Marcus looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the chain in her hand and the vest on the floor behind her. Then he looked back at her face and he saw Ethan in it, obviously not in a way that would have been immediately visible across a crowded room. But here up close he could see it, the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze, the particular quality of stillness she had even in a moment of obvious terror, a stillness that looked like calm even when it was the furthest thing from calm. "He told me if I ever had nowhere else to go," Emily said, "I should bring this here." Marcus exhaled slowly. He turned to Hector and said very quietly, "Clear the back room." Hector moved without a word. Marcus looked back at Emily and said, "Come with me." She didn't hesitate. She picked up the chain and the vest, holding them together against her chest, and she followed him through the crowd that parted to let them pass in absolute silence. The back room at Iron Horse was where the chapter held its serious conversations. It was a plain space, a table, chairs, a single overhead light, walls that had absorbed more history than most courtrooms. Marcus sat down and waited for Emily to settle across from him before he said anything. She placed the chain and the vest on the table between them. He looked at them for a moment, then he looked at her. "How old were you when he died?" 15, Emily said. "And your mother?" Something shifted behind her eyes. "She was gone before him, 8 months after." Marcus absorbed that. He did the math without wanting to. She had been 15 when Ethan died. That meant she had lost her mother at 15 and her father at 15, both within the same year. And she was 20 now, which meant she had been alone in whatever form that took for 5 years. "Where have you been?" he asked. "Everywhere," she said. "Nowhere long enough to matter." "You working?" "Whatever I could find, waitressing mostly, some warehouse work last winter. I had a room above a laundromat in Flagstaff for a while." "Why didn't you come here before?" Marcus asked. The question came out with more weight than he intended, And he heard in it the accusation he had not meant to direct at her, but was really directing somewhere else entirely. She heard the weight of it too. Because he told me it was the last resort, Emily said. He was very specific about that. He said, if there is any other road, take it. If there is any other choice, make it. Only bring the chain if there is nothing left. Mark looked at her steadily. And there's nothing left. There's nothing left, she confirmed. The flatness in her voice when she said it was not defeat. That was what surprised him. He had expected defeat, expected the sound of someone who had given up. What he heard instead was something more like the end of a calculation. She had run the numbers. She had exhausted the options. She was here, not because she had broken, but because she had determined rationally and methodically that this was the correct move. Ethan's daughter. No question about it. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Tell me what happened. Emily folded her hands on the table. She didn't look down at them, which was another thing Marcus noticed. She looked straight at him the whole time she talked. My father had a business, she said, in small engine repair. He built it up over about 8 years, one customer at a time. It wasn't big, but it was clean. It was his. He owned the building, owned the equipment, had a few regular employees who had been with him for years. When he got sick, he set things up to transfer to me when I turned 18. What kind of sick? Marcus asked. Heart condition, Emily said. It moved faster than anyone expected. By the time the doctors figured out how serious it was, he had about 4 months. He used those 4 months well. She paused. He put everything in writing. He hired a lawyer. He created a trust. He was careful because he knew I was young, and he knew people would see that and think it meant I was easy to take from. But they took from you anyway. They took from me anyway. Her voice stayed flat and even, but something moved behind her eyes. The lawyer he hired died 18 months after my father did. Car accident. The files moved to a different attorney in the same firm, someone I had never met. And while all of that was transitioning, 2 men showed up at the business claiming to hold an outstanding debt that gave them a right to a controlling interest. Did they? No, Emily said. The debt was fabricated. I know that now. I didn't know it then because I was 17 and I had just lost both my parents and I didn't know what a fabricated debt looked like or how to fight it. She pressed her lips together briefly. By the time I was 18 and had legal standing to act, they had already been running the business for 6 months. The employees were gone. The name on the sign had changed, and the attorney they retained told me very politely that if I pursued legal action, I would spend years in court losing money I didn't have. Marcus was quiet for a moment. In the letter, the one that told you to come here, Emily reached into the front pocket of her jeans and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. It had been folded and refolded many times. The creases were soft with handling. She slid it across to Marcus but didn't open it. He looked at her. He wrote it himself, she said. 3 weeks before he died, he made me promise not to read it until I was out of options. I kept that promise for 5 years. Marcus unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was Ethan's. He had seen it before on notes left in the clubhouse, on cards sent for funerals and celebrations, on a letter Ethan had once given him when Marcus was going through the worst period of his own life and needed to know someone was paying attention. The handwriting was precise and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who understood that words put on paper last longer than words spoken aloud. The letter was not long. Marcus read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the table and looked at the wall for a moment before he looked back at Emily. He says you're the most stubborn person he ever met, Marcus said. For the first time since she had walked through the door of Iron Horse, Emily Walker almost smiled. It was small and it disappeared quickly, but it was real. He said that a lot. He also says you fight harder when you're angry than when you're scared. Also true. Are you angry right now? She looked at him directly. I've been angry for 2 years. Marcus picked up the letter and read aloud the last paragraph. If my daughter has found her way to you, it means every other door closed on her. It means she tried the roads I taught her to try and they didn't hold. It means she is carrying the chain because she is finally out of weight to carry alone. I am asking you as a brother and as a man who believes in what we promised each other to stand beside her the way you would stand beside me. She has my stubbornness, my patience when she needs it, and my inability to accept that the wrong people get to win. Help her remember that the wrong people don't get to win. The silence in the back room was different from the silence in the main bar. It was not the silence of 300 people holding their breath. It was the silence of one man sitting with the weight of something he had failed to see coming. Marcus folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on the chain. "How long ago did you read this?" he asked. "4 months ago. And it took you 4 months to come here." "It took me 4 months to accept that I was actually out of options," Emily said. "I kept thinking I could find another way." Marcus looked at the chain in the vest. He thought about the night they had buried Ethan Walker, the speeches given the ride they had taken in his honor, the name they had carved into the small memorial wall on the back of the Iron Horse building where they kept the names of lost brothers. He thought about how certain he had been standing in that cemetery 5 years ago that they were honoring Ethan properly, that they were doing right by him. I thought about the fact that nobody had checked on his daughter. Not once. Not once in 5 years. Marcus stood up from the table. He walked to the door of the back room and opened it, and on the other side were Hector and 4 other senior members who had clearly been standing close enough to understand that something serious was happening. Behind them, the main bar had quieted to a low murmur. Everyone was waiting. Marcus looked at his men. "Get me everything we have on 2 individuals operating a business under stolen paperwork in the Phoenix area," he said. "I want to know who they are, where they came from, who their lawyers are, and how they think this ends for them." He paused. "Because I'm going to need them to understand exactly how wrong they are about that." Hector was already reaching for his phone. Marcus turned back to Emily, who was still sitting at the table with her hands folded, watching him. "You're going to stay here tonight," Marcus said. "Not a suggestion." "I have a bag in my car," Emily said. "We'll get it." He studied her. "When did you last eat a real meal?" She thought about it, which was itself an answer. "Right," Marcus said. He turned back to the door. "Someone get food from the kitchen. Real food, not bar food." He looked back at Emily. "Your father was one of the best men I ever knew. I will not sit here and tell you we handled things the way we should have after he was gone. We didn't. That's on us." He stopped. "But it's going to be different now." Emily looked at the chain on the table. "He always said," she said slowly, "that the Hells Angels had a reputation that scared most people, but that the reputation and the reality were 2 different things. He wasn't wrong about that. He said the reality was that you protected people who had nobody else." She lifted her eyes to Marcus. "He said that was the whole point of all of it." Marcus sat back down across from her. "Yeah," he said, "that's the whole point." Outside the backroom, Iron Horse was alive again, but differently than before. The conversations that had resumed were not the same conversations they had been an hour ago. Word was moving through the bar the way word always moved through a room of people who trusted each other. Not as rumor, but as information passed from one member to the next with the specific gravity of something that mattered. Ghost's daughter was here. Ghost's daughter had come home. Nobody had told anyone to feel a particular way about that. Nobody needed to. Marcus looked at Emily Walker across the table at the chain her father had left her at the vest that had crossed the bar floor tonight, dragging 30 years of memory behind it, and he understood something that should have been clear to him 5 years ago. Ethan had not simply left behind a name on a wall, he had left behind a person, and the person was sitting right here. "There are men in this building," Marcus said, "who would have died for your father and vice versa. Every one of them is going to want to know who you are and how you got here." He folded his hands on the table. "But before any of that happens, I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning, not the short version. All of it." Emily nodded. She reached out and laid her hand on the chain for a moment, the way someone touches something they carried a long time and are finally setting down. Then she started talking. And Marcus Stone Callahan, a man who believed he had seen everything, found himself leaning forward to listen. Emily talked for a long time. Marcus didn't interrupt her. That was something Ethan had once told him about the best way to understand a complicated situation. You let the person finish before you start asking questions, because the questions you think you need to ask at the beginning are almost never the right questions by the time they reach the end. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way in his early years, and he had not forgotten it since. So he sat, he listened, and the longer Emily talked, the heavier the air in the back room became. She started with her mother. Her name had been Diana. She and Ethan had met when they were both in their late 20s at a roadside diner in New Mexico where Diana was waitressing, and Ethan had stopped for coffee during a long ride. By Emily's telling, her father had gone into that diner planning to stay 20 minutes and had stayed 3 hours. They were married 8 months later. Emily came along 2 years after that. She never had a problem with what he was, Emily said. Some of the other wives, I remember hearing them talk about it when I was little. The worrying, the not knowing where their husbands were. My mom wasn't like that. She said she knew exactly who she married, and she didn't spend energy being afraid of the parts she'd already accepted. Your father talked about her that way, Marcus said, like she was the smartest person in any room. She was. Emily said it without hesitation, without sentimentality, just as a fact. She was also sick for a long time before anyone knew. By the time the doctors figured it out, it had already moved too far. She died 6 months before my dad got his diagnosis. Marcus did the math again. Diana gone. Then Ethan told he had a heart condition that was further along than it should have been. Then 4 months of watching him put his affairs in order, while Emily, who was 15 years old, tried to understand that she was about to be left entirely alone. What was that like, Marcus asked, those 4 months? Emily was quiet for the moment. Not the silence of someone searching for words, but the silence of someone deciding how honest to be. Then she said, "He didn't let me cry in front of him." Marcus frowned slightly. "He didn't let you." "He said crying was for after. He said we had work to do." She looked at the chain on the table. "At the time, I hated him for it. I was 15 and my father was dying, and he wanted to spend our last months together going over legal documents and teaching me how to read a business balance sheet." She paused. "I understand it now. He was giving me everything he knew how to give in the time he had left. The emotion would have taken up space he didn't have. I was protecting you the only way he could figure out how," Marcus said. "Yes," she pressed her lips together briefly. "I just didn't know that yet." She had been placed with a distant aunt after Ethan's death, a woman in Tucson who was not unkind but who was not equipped for a grieving teenager and made no particular effort to become equipped. Emily had stayed 18 months, finished high school, and left 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. She had gone back to Phoenix to find the business. What she found instead had changed the direction of the next 2 years of her life. The sign on the building said Walker's Small Engine Repair, she said. I was standing outside looking at it, and for a second I actually felt something like relief. Like, okay, the name is still there, it's survived. And then a man came out to tell me I was blocking the entrance. "One of the two men," Marcus said. "Dale Pritchard." She said the name carefully, the way you say a word you've had in your mouth too long and have grown to hate the taste of. He was one of them. The other one was his brother-in-law, Raymond Coyle. They had been operating the business under the debt claim for about 2.5 years by the time I showed up. "What did Pritchard say to you?" Emily's jaw tightened briefly. "He said the business had been acquired through a legal process and that if I had questions, I should direct them to their attorney." He said it in the exact tone of a man who had rehearsed that sentence many times and found it very effective at making people go away. "Did it work on you?" "No," she said. "I told him I was Ethan Walker's daughter and the business had been placed in a trust for me and I wanted to see the paperwork behind the debt claim." He looked at me for about 5 seconds and then he said very quietly that young people who didn't understand how the legal system worked sometimes made the mistake of thinking they had more claim to things than they actually did. She stopped. And then he went back inside and closed the door. Marcus felt something move in his chest that was not quite anger, but was close enough to anger that the distinction didn't much matter. "What did you do?" "I stood there for a while," Emily admitted. "Then I went and found the cheapest library with public computers I could locate, and I started reading everything I could find about debt claims, business trusts, and estate law in Arizona." She had spent 4 months teaching herself the basics of what had been done to her. She was not an attorney. She was not trained in law, but she was, as Ethan's letter had described, the most stubborn person he had ever known. And stubbornness combined with a public library card and 4 months of undivided focus can take a person further than most people expect. What she had found was not simple. The debt that Pritchard and Coyle had used to claim controlling interest in the business had been filed against a version of the business entity that predated the trust Ethan had created. Ethan's attorney, the one who had died in the car accident, had restructured the business as part of the trust creation. The debt claim, if it was legitimate at all, had been filed against the old entity and should not have been transferable to the new structure. But the attorney who had inherited the files had apparently missed that, or chosen not to see it. "You think the attorney was in on it?" Marcus asked. Emily looked at him steadily. "Think the attorney was paid to miss things. I can't prove that. But I can tell you that when I went to that firm and asked to see the original trust documents, I was told they had experienced a records issue and the relevant files were incomplete. A records issue. That's what they said. Marcus leaned forward with his forearms on the table. What did you do with that information? I went to 3 other attorneys and asked them to review what I had pieced together from public records. The first one told me the case was too complicated for the fees I could afford. The second one said I might have something, but it would take years. The third one told me that the people I was dealing with had a history of this kind of filing and had beaten 3 previous challenges in court. She stopped. The room was very quiet. 3 previous challenges, Marcus repeated. 3, Emily confirmed. Pritchard and Coyle had done this before. Different businesses, different owners. Always small operations where the owner had or become incapacitated and left behind people who didn't have the resources to fight a long legal battle. She looked at the chain. My father's business was not the first one they had taken. It was the 4th. Marcus sat back. This was the moment he felt the full weight of what he was dealing with shift into focus. He had walked into the back room assuming this was a family tragedy, a daughter left behind, a business lost through the ordinary cruelty of circumstances. What Emily was describing was something more deliberate than that. Pritchard and Coyle were not opportunists who had stumbled onto a vulnerable situation. They were operating a method, a system. They found businesses whose owners had died, found paperwork angles that the surviving family members were too young or too poor or too overwhelmed to challenge effectively, and they took what they wanted. They had done it 4 times, and they were apparently still doing it. Is the business still running? Marcus asked. It's still running. They changed the name eventually. It's called Phoenix Power Equipment now. Same location, same building, same equipment my father bought and maintained for 8 years. Different name, different owners, different sign. And the employees, the ones who worked for your father. Emily's expression changed slightly. That's the part that made me angrier than anything else, she said. My father's employees. There were 4 of them, men who had been with him for years. He was close with all of them, paid them fairly, helped 2 of them through serious problems. When Pritchard and Coyle took over, they kept 2 of the employees on for about a year and then let them go. The other 2 were fired in the first month. Did any of them stay in touch with you? One of them, Emily said, a man named Carl Briggs. He was my father's main mechanic, had been with him almost since the beginning. Carl is the one who told me that the debt claim was filed 6 days after my father's funeral. She let that sit in the air for a moment. 6 days. They had it ready before he was in the ground. The timing hit Marcus like something physical. 6 days, which meant the preparation had happened before Ethan died, which meant someone had been watching, waiting, monitoring the situation with enough awareness to have a legal filing ready to deploy the moment the man was buried. Carl told me something else, Emily continued. Her voice was still controlled, but Marcus could hear what was underneath it. Now the anger she had described the 2 years of it, and it was not a loose, hot anger. It was dense and pressurized, the kind that had been compressed by time and necessity into something very precise. He told me that a week before my father died, a man he didn't recognize came into the shop asking questions. About the business, about ownership, about whether Ethan had family. Carl said my dad went very quiet when he found out someone had been asking around. He told Carl not to answer questions from strangers about the business. Marcus went still. Ethan knew, he said. He knew someone was watching, Emily said. He didn't know exactly who or exactly how, but he knew. That's why the letter was so specific. That's why he told me to come here only as a last resort, because he didn't want whoever was watching to connect me to the club before I had protection. She paused. He was thinking 3 and 4 steps ahead, even when he was dying. Marcus looked at the chain. 5 years. 5 years that letter had sat in Emily's pocket, and she had walked through all of it alone, following her father's instructions. Even when following them meant not coming here. Even when following them meant one more motel room, one more waitressing shift, one more month of trying to find a road that held. There's something else, Emily said. He looked at her. 6 weeks ago, I was contacted by Carl again. He had kept his ear to the ground all this time, stayed connected to people in the area who knew the business. He told me that Pritchard had started moving to sell the building, sell the property. The property my father owned outright, Emily said. The building, the land, if they sell it, any physical anchor for a legal challenge disappears. The equipment can be moved. The records can be restructured. Everything my father built gets dissolved into a transaction, and the proceeds go to two men who fabricated a debt and have been operating a stolen business for 5 years. When is the sale supposed to happen? Carl thinks within 90 days, maybe less. She looked at Marcus steadily. That's why I'm here now, not because I finally ran out of strength, it's because I ran out of time. The distinction landed with the force of something true. Mark got up from the table and walked to the door and opened it without a word. Hector was still there, along with Danny Vega and two others whose names Marcus would trust with anything. Inside, Marcus said, all of you. They came in and arranged themselves around the small room. Hector looked at Emily with the careful, assessing look of a man who had learned not to make quick judgments. Danny Vega, who was younger and less careful, looked at her with open curiosity. Tell them what you told me, Marcus said to Emily, from the debt claim forward. She did. She was more concise the second time, having found the shape of the story already. She hit the essential points without editorializing, without seeking sympathy, laying it out like a set of facts to be dealt with. Marcus watched his men as they listened, watched their expressions move through the same progression his had, from concentration to understanding to something harder. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Hector said, Dale Pritchard and Raymond Coyle. Yes, Emily said. Phoenix Power Equipment on Camelback. Emily's eyes sharpened. You know them, Hector looked at Marcus. Something passed between the two men in the way things pass between people who have worked together long enough to communicate without language. Marcus said, why do you know that name, Hector? Hector pulled out his phone and scrolled for a moment. Then he turned the screen to face Marcus. Because 3 months ago, Tommy Reeves asked us to look into a business dispute involving that address. His cousin owned a small operation that had been bought out under pressure about 2 years before Phoenix Power Equipment showed up. The room absorbed that. Emily leaned forward. What happened to Tommy's cousin? Settled out of court, Hector said. The terms were confidential. His cousin walked away with enough money to stay quiet and not enough to make it worth reopening. He put his phone down. He always thought something was wrong with it, but he didn't have the resources to push. That would make 5, Emily said. Her voice had a different quality now, not louder, but denser. 5 businesses, 5 families. Marcus turned to Danny. I need you to get me everything available on Pritchard and Coyle. Business filings, property records, court records, anything public. Tonight. Danny was already moving toward the door. And find Carl Briggs, Marcus added to Hector. Emily has his contact information. I want to talk to him directly. He turned back to Emily. She was watching him with an expression that was difficult to read because it was made up of too many things at once. There was something that might have been relief and something that was clearly not relief yet, because she had learned in 5 years not to feel relief prematurely. There was assessment, the same calculation that had been in her eyes since she walked through the door. And there was something underneath both of those things, something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a person who has been alone a very long time and has just felt the first weight transfer from their own shoulders to someone else's, and is not quite sure yet how to stand with the difference. You said 3 previous challenges failed, Marcus said. Yes. What made them fail? Resources, Emily said immediately. Every family that tried to fight was doing it alone. Private citizens without money taking on people with attorneys who had fought this specific kind of case before. She met his eyes. They didn't have anyone in their corner who they actually trusted. Marcus nodded slowly. You mentioned Carl told you the sale might happen in 90 days, he said. Might. He didn't know exactly. He doesn't have access to the specific transaction details. He's working from what he overhears and what people in the area know. So we might have less time than 90 days. Yes. Or we might have more. Possibly. Marcus looked at the vest on the table one more time. Then he looked at Emily. I'm going to ask you something and I need an honest answer, he said. All right. Are you willing to stay in Phoenix while this gets handled? Not disappear, not back on the road, not decide after a week that it's too complicated and move on. Emily's expression didn't waver. I have been waiting for 2 years to stop moving. That's not the same as saying yes. Yes, she said. I'm willing to stay. Marcus stood up and extended his hand across the table the way he had sealed every agreement that actually mattered in the last 30 years. Emily Walker looked at his hand for just a moment, the way someone looks at something they have been walking toward for a very long time and need 1 second to confirm it is actually real. Then she reached across the chain and the vest in the letter that had held her father's last words, and she shook it. Outside the back room, the sounds of Iron Horse had settled into a different register. Not the loud celebration of earlier, but the focused, purposeful murmur of men who were working through something together. Word had continued to spread. People who had ridden with Ethan Walker in the years before he died were gathering near the bar, talking quietly, sharing things they remembered. A woman named Rosa, who ran the kitchen, came in with a plate of food without being asked and set it in front of Emily without comment and walked back out. It was a purely practical gesture, entirely human, and Emily looked at the plate for a moment as if she had temporarily forgotten that this was the kind of thing people did for each other. Eat, Marcus said. She ate. He sat across from her and let her eat without conversation for a few minutes, watching the room through the open door. He was thinking about Ethan, about the last time he had seen him, which had been at a small gathering, about 2 months before his death, when Ethan was thinner than he should have been, but was still moving with the same deliberate energy he always carried. Marcus had known that day that Ethan was closer to the end than either of them was saying out loud. He had not known what to do with that knowledge, and so he had done what men of his particular type often did with things they didn't know what to do with. He had set it aside and trusted that the moment would reveal the correct response when it arrived. The moment had arrived 5 years later in the form of a 20-year-old woman dragging a chain across his floor. He thought about the 3 businesses before this one, the families, the people who had been left holding something they didn't have enough hands to hold and had eventually had to let go. He thought about Tommy Reeves's cousin who had walked away with a confidential settlement and a silence that had probably cost him more than the money. And then he thought about the fact that Pritchard and Coyle had been doing this for years in his city, in his territory, and he hadn't known. That was a specific kind of failure, not a dramatic one, not the kind where you made a decision you later recognized as wrong, the quieter kind, the kind where you simply never looked in the direction where the problem was forming, where your attention was always on the things directly in front of you, and the harm was happening somewhere at the edge of your vision that you had never thought to turn toward. Hector came back into the room while Emily was finishing eating. "Danny's pulling records," he said, "but I already found something." He put his phone face up on the table. On the screen was a county property record. The building that had been Ethan Walker's workshop, the building he had bought and paid for, the building where he had spent 8 years building something honest from the ground up, was listed as being under a purchase agreement, executed 3 weeks ago. The buyer was an LLC with a name that meant nothing on its surface, but the registered agent for that LLC was a law firm, and the law firm was the same one that had inherited Emily's incomplete trust files. Emily looked at the screen. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "They're not just selling it, they're selling it to themselves." The room went completely still. Hector said, "Through a shell." "Through a shell," Emily confirmed. "So the money appears to transfer out, but it stays in the same orbit. They liquidate the asset, clear whatever paper trail exists connecting them to the original acquisition, and restart clean somewhere else." She looked up at Marcus. "This isn't the end of the operation. This is them cleaning up before they do it again." Marcus stood up from the table. "I was not a man who showed anger easily. That was something people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for calm. It was not calm, it was control, the kind built over decades of understanding that the most effective response to a situation was rarely the loudest one. But Hector knew the difference, and so he said nothing. And Danny, who had come back into the room just in time to hear the last part, also said nothing. Marcus looked at Emily Walker, daughter of a man who had once stood beside him when standing was the harder choice. And he thought about the letter still folded on the table and the chain that had scraped across his floor tonight, and the 5 years this girl had spent trying to find a road that held. "They've had 5 years," he said. "They're not getting 90 days. Emily held his gaze. And for the first time since she had walked through the door of Iron Horse Tavern, dragging her father's memory behind her, she did not look like a person bracing against something. She looked like a person who finally had something solid at her back. Marcus turned to Hector. "Get everyone we trust in the same room by morning," he said. "Not a conversation, a plan." Hector nodded once. And find out who is inside that law firm, Marcus added, because Pritchard and Coyle didn't build this alone. Somebody with a license and a case number helped them every step of the way. He picked up Ethan's letter from the table and held it for a moment. Then he folded it and handed it back to Emily. Keep that, he said. You're going to want it later. She took it without asking why. She already knew. Nobody slept much that night. Marcus didn't try. He sat at the table in the back room long after Emily had been taken to the room they kept above the bar for situations exactly like this one, the kind of situations where someone needed a safe place and the club was the safest place available. He sat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and Ethan's letter in front of him, and he went through everything Emily had told him, not looking for gaps in her story, because there weren't any, but looking for the shape of what they were actually dealing with. Pritchard and Coyle were not small-time. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Small-time operators made mistakes. They got greedy too fast, or they got sloppy, or they underestimated the people they were taking from, and one of those underestimations eventually cost them. But these two had run 4 clean acquisitions over however many years, had survived 3 legal challenges without a single loss, and were now in the process of executing a shell transaction sophisticated enough that it would have taken a forensic accountant to spot it quickly. That level of operation did not come from 2 men with a simple scheme and a talent for paperwork. It came from infrastructure. Somebody had built them infrastructure. Hector came back in around 2 in the morning with Danny and a man named Reese, who was the closest thing the chapter had to a financial specialist, a former bank examiner who had left his career under circumstances he never discussed in detail and had been with the club for 11 years. Reese was quiet, methodical, and possessed of the specific gift of being able to look at a set of numbers and immediately see what was missing from them. Marcus pushed the property record printout across the table to Reese without preamble. Reese looked at it for about 45 seconds. The LLC was registered 8 months ago, Reese said. Before the sale was arranged, Marcus said. Before any public indication of a sale was arranged, Reese corrected. He pulled the printout closer. The registered agent is Whitmore and Associates. They're a mid-sized firm, primarily commercial real estate transactions. They've been operating in Phoenix for about 14 years. Are they connected to the original debt filing? Reese was already scrolling through his phone. Not directly. The original filing was handled by a solo practitioner named Gerald Fenn. He's the one who died in the car accident. The files transferred to a junior partner at his firm, a woman named Carla D'Souza. He paused. Whitmore and Associates hired D'Souza away from that firm approximately 18 months ago. The room went still in that particular way. It went still when something that had seemed like a coincidence stopped being one. Danny said, so D'Souza carried the Walker files with her when she moved. She would have had access to them, Reese said carefully. Whether she took them is a different question. She didn't need to take them, Marcus said. She just needed to know what was in them, what the trust structure looked like, what the vulnerabilities were, what timeline was in play. He looked at Hector. Find out how long D'Souza has been connected to Pritchard and Coyle. On it, Hector said and stepped out of the room. Reese kept working. He had pulled a laptop from somewhere and was running searches with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent years being paid to find exactly this kind of thing and hadn't lost the skill set simply because the employer had changed. Marcus watched him work and thought about the network they were uncovering, the web of it, how each thread connected to another thread, how nothing about this was accidental. There's something else, Reese said without looking up from the screen. Tell me. The LLC that's buying the building. I found a parallel structure registered in Nevada. He turned the laptop so Marcus could see it. Same registered agent, similar filing date, different name members, but the capitalization pattern is identical. He pointed to a column of numbers that meant very little to Marcus visually, but clearly meant something significant to Reese. They're not just doing this in Phoenix. Danny leaned over to look at the screen. How many states? I'd need more time to map it fully, but from what I'm seeing tonight at minimum 3, Arizona, Nevada, and I'm seeing indicators in New Mexico. Reese sat back. This isn't a local scheme. It's a regional operation. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how many businesses? If the pattern holds across all 3 states, Reese looked at him steadily. More than 5. The weight of that number settled into the room and stayed there. Marcus thought about the families. Not in an abstract way, but concretely the way he thought about things that required action. How many people had sat where Emily was sitting, trying to understand why something that had been legally protected had vanished anyway, trying to find someone who had the ability and the willingness to stand beside them? How many of them had not had a father who left behind a chain and an address? How many of them had simply run out of road with nobody waiting at the end of it? He stood up. "Get me everything by morning," he said to Reese. "Every entity, every filing, every connected name you can find. I'll need until 6 or 7. Then I'll see you at 6 or 7. He walked out of the back room and through the main bar, which was nearly empty. Now just a couple of members who had chosen to stay and were sitting quietly with drinks. They weren't really drinking. The jukebox was finally off. The parking lot outside had thinned to about 30 bikes, the ones belonging to people who had decided without anyone asking them to decide that they would be available in the morning. Marcus stood outside for a few minutes. He thought about Ethan. I thought about the day Ethan had been voted into the club, a younger man then, but already carrying that same quality of deliberate stillness, the quality his daughter had inherited. He thought about a night 12 years back when Ethan had driven 4 hours in the dark to sit with Marcus, through something Marcus had not known how to get through, alone had not asked for help but had needed it, and Ethan had somehow known and had shown up anyway. Had sat there in the way good people sit with each other, when words aren't the right tool present and steady and not requiring anything in return. Marcus had never asked how Ethan knew to come. He just had. And now his daughter was sleeping upstairs with everything her father had left her folded in the pocket of her jeans. And somewhere in the city, 2 men were preparing to erase the last physical trace of Ethan Walker's life's work. Marcus went back inside. He was not going to sleep. He had things to plan. By 7 in the morning, the back room held 8 people. Marcus, Hector, Danny Reese, and 4 other senior members who had known Ethan personally and had been called without explanation simply because Marcus had asked them to come. They had come because that was the kind of men they were. Emily came down at 6:30. She had clearly slept, but not deeply, and she had a quality of sharpened alertness that Marcus recognized from the night before. She was carrying the chain again. Not dragging it this time, holding it looped in her hand, the way a person carries something they have decided to stop being burdened by and start being armed with. She sat down at the table and looked at the room full of men she didn't know and said simply, "What did you find?" Reese walked her through it. He was careful and thorough, the way he was always careful and thorough, laying out each piece in sequence, showing his sourcing, not overstating what he knew and being precise about what he was inferring. Emily listened without interrupting, which Marcus noticed and appreciated because most people interrupted Reese within the first 3 minutes, and it slowed everything down. When Reese finished, she asked 3 questions. The first was about the timeline of D'Souza's move to Whitmore and Associates relative to the Nevada filings. Reese pulled up the dates and they aligned in a way that was damning without being conclusive. The second was about the nature of the Shell LLC's capitalization. Reese explained. Emily nodded and said, "So the money that appears to fund the purchase is sourced from the previous acquisitions." Reese blinked. "That's what the pattern suggests, yes. It's a cycle," she said. "Each acquisition funds the next one. They're not investing outside capital. They're using the stolen assets as the capital base." "That's correct." The third question surprised everyone in the room. "What happened to Gerald Fenn?" she asked. The question landed quietly and then expanded the way certain questions do. Reese looked at her. "The original attorney, he died in a car accident." "I know," Emily said. "I've known that for years. But I never looked into it closely because I was a teenager with no resources when it happened, and there was nothing I could have done with the information even if I had found something." She looked around the table. "We have resources now. I want to know whether Gerald Fenn's accident was actually an accident." The silence in the room was the specific silence of people who had not thought of that and should have. Marcus looked at Hector. Hector was already reaching for his phone. Danny said out loud what several people in the room were clearly thinking. "If it wasn't an accident, then this isn't just fraud," Emily said. She held his eyes. "And the people we're dealing with are considerably more dangerous than a pair of opportunists with a debt filing scheme." Marcus had dealt with dangerous people before. The kind of danger she was describing was a different category from what he normally navigated, because it was the kind that wore a suit and operated through attorneys and shell companies and used the law itself as the primary weapon. It was in some ways harder to fight than the more straightforward kind, but it was not impossible to fight. He let the room sit with what Emily had said for about 30 seconds. Then he said, Reese, add Fenn's accident to what you're looking into. Everything public, everything available. I want dates. I want the accident report. I want anything that's out there. Reese nodded and typed. Hector, find Carl Briggs. Today. Already tried this morning, Hector said. He's not answering his phone. Emily's head came up sharply. When did you last speak with him? Marcus asked her. 2 weeks ago. He was fine. He was the one who told me about the sale. She was very still in the way she went still when she was controlling something. He knew I was coming here. I told him that was my plan. You told him you were coming to Phoenix. I told him I was going to find help. I didn't tell him where. She looked at Marcus directly. But if they've been watching me, if they knew my father sent me here, they might have known to watch Carl, Marcus finished. Carl doesn't have anyone, Emily said. He lives alone. He's been retired for 2 years. She put the chain down on the table, which was the first time she had set it down voluntarily since the night before. If something happened to him because he helped me, we don't know that something happened, Marcus said, firmly but not harshly. He might have turned his phone off. He might be out of range. We don't know yet. Then find out fast, Emily said. Her voice had an edge in it that hadn't been there before, and Marcus understood it precisely. This was the specific fear of someone who was used to being alone, absorbing the consequences of a situation, the fear that her decision to finally ask for help had extended the blast radius to someone who didn't deserve to be in it. Danny, Marcus said. I'll find him personally, Danny said, and he was out of the room before Marcus finished nodding. The meeting continued, but with a different current running under it now. The investigation had shifted from uncovering what Pritchard and Coyle had done to understanding how far their reach actually extended. And those were two different questions with two very different sets of implications. A local fraud operation was one kind of problem. A regional operation that had potentially removed a witness through means that looked like an accident was a considerably more serious kind. Reese found the police report on Gerald Fenn's accident within the hour. He read it twice before he said anything. Then he turned the laptop around. Single vehicle, he said. He went off Route 93 north of Wickenburg at 2 in the morning. No witnesses. The official cause was distracted driving. He was 44, no prior incidents, no history of driving issues. Reese pointed to a section of the report. The investigation was handled by a county deputy named Roy Staller. Marcus looked at the name. It meant nothing to him immediately. Roy Staller, Hector said from the corner of the room. Retired from Maricopa County Sheriff's Department 3 years ago. He now works private security consulting. He paused. For Whitmore and Associates. The room went completely silent. Marcus looked at Hector for a long moment. Hector looked back at him with the flat, careful expression of a man who had just confirmed something he had been hoping not to confirm. Emily was sitting very straight. Let me be clear about what we're looking at, Reese said with the measured precision of someone who understood that this moment required exactness. We have an attorney who died investigating on behalf of the Walker estate. We have a deputy who handled that investigation and later took employment with the firm, now executing the shell transaction. We have a pattern of acquisitions across at least 3 states. And we have a potential witness who is currently not answering his phone. He stopped. Any one of these things could be a coincidence. All of them together is not a coincidence. Emily said, My father knew. Everyone looked at her. He knew there was someone watching before he died. He knew they were organized enough to have filed before he was buried. He built in a protection for me that required me not to come here immediately, not to connect myself to the Hells Angels until I had protection in place. She looked at Marcus. He understood what these people were capable of. He understood it well enough to design a 5-year waiting protocol to keep me safe. Marcus heard in that the thing she had not said directly, which was, my father understood the danger better than I did, and he gave his life protecting me from it. And I have been walking inside that protection for 5 years without knowing it. He heard it, and he did not say it out loud, because some things don't need to be said out loud. Sometimes the right response to a truth that large is simply to let it breathe. The person we need, Marcus said after a moment, is someone inside Whitmore and Associates. Reese shook his head slightly. That's difficult without... Not a plant, Marcus said. Someone who is already uncomfortable. Someone who knows enough to be worried about what they know. He looked at Hector. D'Souza moved from a solo practitioner's firm to a large commercial operation. That's a career move that made sense on paper, but she's been there 18 months and she's been sitting on files that connect her to a fraud operation that is now looking like it might be something worse. He paused. How comfortable do you think Carla D'Souza actually is? The question sat in the room. Emily was the one who answered it. Not comfortable, she said. If she's smart enough to have gotten her law license, she's smart enough to understand what she's involved in. And if she understood what Gerald Fenn's death actually was, she has been living with that for 18 months. People who are living with something, Marcus said, are looking for a way to put it down. But they need to believe the alternative is safer than the silence, Emily said, which is where we come in. She looked at him with an expression that was beginning to carry something new in it, something beyond the calibrated wariness she had walked in with. It was not quite trust, not yet, because trust of that degree takes time that they had not had. But it was the beginning of something adjacent to trust, the recognition that the person across from you is thinking in the same direction you're thinking and has the ability to get there. I need to be involved in the conversation with D'Souza, Emily said, if it happens. That's not the safest. I know it's not the safest choice, she said. But I'm the one who can tell her things that can't be confirmed any other way. I know what was in my father's files because I've been reconstructing them for 2 years. I know what Fenn would have known. If she's been sitting on this wondering whether anyone else has figured it out, I'm the person who can tell her, yes, someone has figured it out, and she is not the last person holding information. She met Marcus's eyes steadily. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you why it has to be me. The directness of it silenced the room for a beat. Then Marcus said, your father said you had his stubbornness. He wasn't being complimentary when he said it, Emily replied. No, Marcus agreed, but he wasn't wrong either. Danny came back into the room at 9:30. The expression on his face when he walked in told Marcus everything before Danny said a single word. Marcus had known Danny Vega for 18 years. He had seen every variation of that face in every kind of situation. The expression he was wearing now was the one he wore when the news was bad and he was choosing how to say it. The room felt it too. Emily went still in the way she went still. Danny looked at Marcus. Carl Briggs is in the hospital, Phoenix General. He was admitted 2 nights ago. He stopped. Hit and run. He was walking home from a grocery store. The silence was total. Emily's hand went to the chain on the table without her seeming to notice she had reached for it. How bad? Marcus asked. Broken ribs, a broken arm, concussion. They say he's stable. Danny's voice was careful and controlled. He's awake. He can talk. Is he willing to talk to us? Danny looked at Emily. He asked for her specifically. When I told him who I was and why I was there, he said the only person he wanted to speak to was Emily Walker. Every head in the room turned. Emily was already standing. She picked up the chain. She looked at Marcus. I need to go now, she said. Marcus stood up. You're not going alone. She didn't argue. She was already moving toward the door. The drive to Phoenix General took 22 minutes. Marcus drove Emily in the passenger seat, Hector in the back. She did not talk during the drive, which Marcus respected completely. He understood what she was carrying in those 22 minutes, the weight of knowing that a man had been hurt because he had helped her, the specific guilt of that, and the understanding that guilt was not useful right now, but that it would need somewhere to go eventually. Carl Briggs was in a room on the 3rd floor. He was smaller than Marcus had pictured from Emily's description, a compact man in his mid-60s, with the weathered quality of someone who had spent decades working with his hands. His arm was in a cast from wrist to elbow. His face carried the yellowish bruising of someone who had absorbed a significant impact, and the monitors beside him were keeping a steady, quiet account of the fact that his body was working hard to repair itself. He saw Emily in the doorway and something in his face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. Kid, he said. His voice was rough from whatever they had given him, but there was warmth under the roughness. You made it. Emily crossed the room and pulled a chair to his bedside and sat down. She put her hand over his good hand on the mattress. I made it, she said. Your dad would have... Carl stopped, collected himself. He would have said something that sounded tough but meant he was proud. He definitely would have, Emily said. Carl looked at Marcus, then at Hector, with the assessment of a man who has learned to read people through years of working in environments where reading people correctly was a practical necessity. These are the people he told you to find, Carl said. It was not a question. Yes, Emily said. Carl nodded slowly. He seemed to be deciding something, working through an internal deliberation, and Marcus stayed quiet because this was clearly not a moment for pushing. The man had been hit by a car 2 nights ago. He had earned the right to take a moment. The night before they hit me, Carl said finally, someone called my cell phone, unknown number. They didn't say much. Just that it would be better for me to forget about the Walker situation and that some things were better left alone. He paused. I'd been getting calls like that for about 3 weeks. I stopped answering unknown numbers. But that last night I picked up because I thought it might be Emily. Did they say anything specific? Marcus asked. Carl looked at him. They mentioned Emily by name. They said she had made some unwise choices reaching out to people she shouldn't have, and that people who helped her were taking on a risk they probably didn't understand. He stopped. 2 hours later, I was on the ground in a parking lot, and whoever did it was gone. Emily's hand tightened over Carl's. They were watching you, Hector said, and they knew Emily had been in contact with you. They've been watching both of us for a while, I think, Carl said. After Emily called me about the sale, I started paying attention to things I had been ignoring before. Someone drove past my house 4 days in a row. I thought I was being paranoid. He exhaled carefully the way a man with broken ribs learns to exhale. I wasn't being paranoid. Carl, Emily said. Her voice was steady, but Marcus could hear what was underneath it. I need to ask you something, and I need the full answer. Go ahead. When Gerald Fenn died, did you know him? Carl was quiet for a moment that was longer than necessary if the answer was simply no. I met him twice, Carl said. He came to the shop about 2 months before your dad died. He was asking questions about the business structure, the employees, the ownership history. Your dad had hired him specifically to document everything. Make sure the transfer to you was bulletproof. He looked at Emily directly. He was a careful man, thorough. He had a legal pad and he filled it front and back both visits. He told me he was building a record that would hold up against any challenge. And then he died, Emily said. And then he died, Carl confirmed. And I thought about it. I thought about it a lot. But I was a mechanic. I was a retired mechanic. I didn't know what to do with what I thought. So I did what I knew how to do, which was stay close to the situation and pay attention. You've been watching this for 5 years, Marcus said. Carl looked at him. Someone had to. The directness of it was not heroic. It was just true. It was the truth of a man who had loved his employer, who had known what was happening, was wrong, who had stayed in the orbit of the situation because walking away from it entirely would have felt like a second betrayal after the first one. Did Fenn tell you anything specific? Marcus pressed. Anything that stayed with you? Carl thought about it. He said he'd found something in the original business filings that would make any debt claim against the new structure legally indefensible. He was very specific about that word, indefensible. His eyes went to Emily. He said whoever came after that business would hit a wall they couldn't get through. And then before he could file anything, Emily said, he was dead. And then before he could file anything, Carl confirmed quietly. Marcus looked at Hector over Carl's bed. Hector said, the record, Fenn's legal pad, if it still exists. It would be proof, Reese said from the doorway, where he had apparently arrived while Marcus wasn't watching the door. Not just of the fraud, of premeditation, of exactly when they knew what they were dealing with and what they did about it. Carl reached slowly with his good hand to the narrow table beside his bed. He pulled open the drawer. He reached to the back of it and withdrew something that he had clearly placed there before Marcus and the others had arrived, placed with the specific intentionality of a man who understood that this moment was coming and had prepared for it. It was a photograph. Carl held it out to Emily. She took it. It was a photo of Gerald Fenn taken inside the shop. He was standing at the workbench, legal pad open in front of him, looking at the camera with the slightly distracted expression of a man who had not noticed the photo being taken. On the bench beside him, visible in the image, were the open business files of Walker's small engine repair. And in the background, slightly out of focus but readable if you looked carefully, was the whiteboard Ethan had kept on the wall for tracking outstanding work orders. Written in Ethan's handwriting at the top of the board was a date, 8 days before Fenn's accident. And below the date in Ethan's hand were 2 words that hadn't seemed significant when Carl had kept the photo, but that now in this room with everything they knew arranged around them, like pieces of a map that had finally started to show its shape, were the most significant 2 words in the picture. The words said, "They know." Emily stared at the photograph. She stared at it for a long time. Then she looked up at Marcus with eyes that were completely clear and completely certain, and she said in a voice that was so quiet and so absolute that it carried across the entire room without effort. "My father knew exactly what was coming, and he built us a way to fight it anyway." Marcus took the photograph from her carefully. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Emily Walker, 20 years old, carrying a chain that had traveled 5 years to reach this room, and he understood with a clarity that settled into him, like something long overdue, that Ethan Ghost Walker had not simply sent his daughter to them for protection. He had sent her with everything they needed to finish this. Marcus kept the photograph and held it the entire drive back and from Phoenix General, and when they pulled into the Iron Horse lot and the others climbed out and started talking about next steps, he stayed in the truck for an extra minute, just looking at it. Ethan's handwriting on the whiteboard in the background. "They know," 2 words written 8 days before a man drove off a road in the dark and didn't come back. 2 words that proved Ethan Walker had understood exactly what kind of people were circling his life's work and had chosen with full awareness of what that understanding cost him to keep building Emily's protection anyway instead of running. That was Ethan. That had always been Ethan. Marcus got out of the truck. The day had shifted while they were at the hospital. The morning heat was fully established now, pressing down in the particular way Arizona heat pressed in late October when it refused to accept the calendar. The parking lot held 15 bikes. All of them belonged to people who had decided without being asked that they were staying. Hector fell into step beside him. "Reese has more," Hector said. "How much more?" "Enough that you're going to want to sit down." They went back into the back room. Emily came in behind them and took her chair without ceremony, the chain looped over the back of it. She had been quiet on the drive back, processing Carl's hospital room, the way Marcus could see her processing everything, turning it over, finding its angles, placing it inside the larger structure of what she was building in her mind. Reese had the laptop open and 3 separate documents printed and laid out on the table. "Gerald Fenn," he said without preamble. "I found his case records through the county probate court. Before he died, he had filed a preliminary motion in the Walker estate matter. The motion challenged the legitimacy of the debt claim on the grounds that the restructured business entity was a separate legal instrument from the original one the debt had been filed against." He looked up. He filed it 6 days before he died. The room absorbed that. "So the filing exists," Marcus said. "The filing exists. It's a public court record. It was never acted on because Fenn died before the motion was heard, and when his files transferred to D'Souza, the motion was listed as pending but was never advanced." Reese held up one of the printed documents. "It has been sitting in the probate court system for 5 years as an open unresolved motion." Emily leaned forward. "Is it still valid?" "That is the question I spent the last 2 hours trying to answer," Reese said. "And the answer, according to 3 different legal databases and a retired judge I called at 7 this morning who owed me a favor, is yes. The motion is still valid. It never expired because it was never formally withdrawn or denied. It has been sitting open in the system the entire time." Marcus looked at Emily. She was very still. "Fenn built us a door," she said quietly. "He built you a door," Reese confirmed. "And D'Souza, who inherited the files and the access to that motion, either didn't know it was there or knew it was there and chose not to use it. Or was paid not to use it," Hector said. "Or was paid not to use it," Reese agreed. "If we can get into the probate court and advance that motion, we restart the legal challenge with a 5-year-old filing that predates every subsequent transaction Pritchard and Coyle have executed, including the shell sale. Meaning the sale can't be completed while the motion is active," Emily said. "Meaning the sale can't be legally completed while the motion is active and properly advanced," Reese said. "Yes." Marcus looked around the table. At Hector, who was already calculating. At Danny, who had come back in while Reese was talking. At the older members along the wall who had been with Ethan, who were sitting with the specific quality of men who have spent decades understanding that some debts don't expire. "We need an attorney to advance the motion," Marcus said. "We need a specific kind of attorney," Emily said. "One who can't be leaned on, one who doesn't have existing connections to Whitmore and Associates or anyone in their orbit." She looked at Marcus directly. "Do you know someone like that?" Marcus thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, "I know someone exactly like that. Her name was Patricia Solano. and she had represented the Hells Angels chapter in various legal matters for 19 years, in a way that could be described as fiercely effective and could also be described by people on the other side of her arguments as a force of nature in a blazer. She was 61 years old, had grown up in South Phoenix when South Phoenix was not a place that produced a lot of attorneys, and she had a particular kind of contempt for people who used legal structures as weapons against people who couldn't afford to defend themselves. It was not the detached professional contempt of someone who had chosen a specialty. It was personal. It came from somewhere real, and it had never softened. Marcus called her. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already in her office. "I need you today," Marcus said. "You always need me," she said. "What is it?" "A probate motion that's been sitting open for 5 years, a fraud operation running across 3 states, a potential witness intimidation situation, and a woman named Carla D'Souza, who I believe is sitting on information that could break this open if someone she trusts asks her the right questions." There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted about 3 seconds. "I'll be there in an hour," Patricia said. She was there in 45 minutes. Patricia Solano was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair. She kept short and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and only put on when she was reading something she needed to see precisely, which was most things. She came into the back room and shook hands with everyone at the table in a businesslike way, and then sat down and looked at Emily and said, "Your ghost daughter." Emily blinked. "You knew my father. He consulted me once about his business structure. About 6 months before he died." Patricia's voice was precise. "He didn't hire me. He said he had already found an attorney, but he wanted a second opinion on the trust document." She paused. "I told him the trust was well constructed, but that the restructuring of the business entity was the most important protection he had, and he needed to make certain his attorney documented it thoroughly." Emily looked at her steadily. "Do you think Fenn followed that advice?" "I think Gerald Fenn filed a motion that has been sitting in the probate court for 5 years that proves he did exactly that," Patricia said. She held out her hand to Reese. "Show me what you have." Reese handed her the documents. She read them the way she read everything, thoroughly and quickly, with the glasses on, not speaking while she read. The room was quiet. Marcus watched Emily watching Patricia and saw in Emily's expression the careful measuring quality of someone deciding whether to extend trust to a new variable in a situation where the wrong trust had cost her before. Patricia put the documents down and took her glasses off. "The motion is valid," she said. "I can advance it. It will require a filing fee and a notice to all interested parties, which means Pritchard Coyle, their attorneys at Whitmore and Associates in the LLC, currently under the purchase agreement." She looked at Marcus. "They will know we have found the motion within 24 hours of filing." "How will they respond?" Marcus asked. "Urgently," Patricia said. "They will try to complete the sale before the motion can be heard, which means they'll accelerate the closing timeline. They may also attempt to have the motion dismissed on procedural grounds." She paused. "They will not succeed on the procedural challenge if I file correctly, which I will. But the acceleration is the real danger. If the building transfers before we can get a hold placed on the transaction, the legal situation becomes significantly more complicated." "How quickly can you file?" Emily asked. Patricia looked at her. "If I leave this room in the next 2 hours with everything I need, I can file by end of business today." "Then let's not waste the 2 hours," Emily said. They worked. It was not the dramatic kind of work that looks significant from the outside. It was the meticulous, grinding, essential kind, going through documents, reconstructing the chain of custody of the estate files, establishing the factual record that Patricia needed to advance the motion with the strongest possible foundation. Emily knew things that were not in any document, things Ethan had told her during those 4 months, details about the business structure that Fenn had captured on his legal pad and that Emily had absorbed at 15 and carried for 5 years without knowing exactly what they were for. She knew now. Every detail she provided Patricia captured in notes that were precise and structured. Every piece of the reconstruction that connected one element to another was documented and attributed. The picture that emerged was not just a fraud case. It was a case with a 5-year paper trail, a dead attorney, a hospitalized witness, a pending shell transaction, and a motion already filed in the system that functioned as a loaded weapon that had been sitting in a drawer waiting for someone to pick it up. At one point during the working session, Danny came into the room and spoke quietly to Hector. Hector's expression shifted in the way that meant the information was significant. Marcus saw it and caught Hector's eye. Hector said, D'Souza called in sick to Whitmore and Associates this morning. The work at the table paused. Patricia said without looking up from her notes, interesting timing. It could mean she knows something is moving, Marcus said. It could mean she's been waiting for something to move, and now that it is, she's trying to decide what to do, Emily said. Marcus looked at her. You still want to be the one to talk to her. I'm the one who should talk to her, Emily said. She's an attorney who inherited files she probably didn't fully understand and has since figured out that she's sitting in the middle of something that includes at minimum fraud and at maximum a man who died because he knew too much. She held Marcus's eyes. She doesn't need someone who's going to threaten her. She needs someone who is going to sit across from her and tell her the truth about what happens to the people who stay quiet versus the people who don't. Emily paused. I have been staying quiet for 5 years. I know exactly what that costs. Patricia looked up from her notes. She looked at Emily for a long moment. Then she said to Marcus, let her do it. Marcus thought about it. I thought about Ethan's letter, about the line that said, she has my stubbornness, my patience when she needs it, and my inability to accept that the wrong people get to win. He thought about the photograph from Carl's hospital drawer and the 2 words written on Ethan's whiteboard. He thought about the specific kind of courage required to walk into a biker bar alone at 20 years old, dragging your dead father's chain across the floor because every other door had closed. All right, he said. Emily nodded once. Then she said to Patricia, can you find her address? I can find her work address. Patricia said, I won't provide a private residential address. We do this correctly. Her work address is fine, Emily said. If she called in sick, she's at home. But her work address is where we reach out through proper channels and we give her the opportunity to choose. You're not going to show up at her house, Marcus said. It was not a question. I'm going to send her a letter, Emily said, through Patricia's office, formal professional on legal letterhead, explaining that a motion has been filed, that certain documents have come to light, and that we are interested in speaking with her as someone who may be able to provide context. She looked at Patricia. Is that something you can send? I can send that today, Patricia said. Send it certified mail and email, Emily said. I want her to know we are operating above board every step of the way. I want her to understand that the people reaching out to her are not the kind of people she needs to be afraid of. Danny, who had been listening from his position near the door, said quietly, she's going to be afraid of Marcus. She doesn't need to meet Marcus yet, Emily said. Marcus, who found this assessment of the situation entirely reasonable, said nothing. Patricia filed the motion at 4:17 in the afternoon. Marcus knew the exact time because Hector told him, and because the 14 minutes between when Patricia left the courthouse and when the first call came into the Iron Horse landline felt like the specific kind of quiet that precedes something. The call was from a number registered to Whitmore and Associates. Hector answered, listened for about 30 seconds, said, I'll pass that along, and hung up. They want to arrange a conversation, Hector said. They're framing it as a misunderstanding they'd like to resolve. Of course they are, Marcus said. They specifically asked to speak with whoever represents the Walker estate interests. That would be Patricia, Emily said. They specifically asked not to speak with Patricia Solano, Hector said. By name. The room processed that. They know who we retained, Marcus said. They found out within 3 hours of the filing, Reese said, which means they have a contact in the courthouse, which meant the network extended further than Whitmore and Associates, which meant there were people inside the county system who were either on the payroll or who owed sufficient favors that they were willing to monitor filings and report on them with a 3-hour turnaround. Emily said, how many people are in this thing? Nobody answered immediately because nobody had a good answer yet. Marcus said enough that we need to be careful about where we talk and who we talk to. He looked at Hector. Tell no one outside this room about the motion until Patricia confirms it's been properly served. Already done, Hector said. Marcus turned back to the table. He looked at Emily and saw that she was doing the same thing he was doing, recalibrating the scale of what they were dealing with. She had come to Iron Horse because she had exhausted every other option. She had understood that Pritchard and Coyle were sophisticated and had connections. She had not understood fully until this moment that the connections went deep enough into the county system that a court filing could be tracked and reported in 3 hours. She looked at Marcus and said, he knew. Ethan, he knew it was this big, she said. That's why he told me to wait, to stay off the radar, to not connect myself to anyone he trusted until I had protection that could match the scale of what I was walking into. Her voice was very controlled. He was protecting me from something that took me 5 years to fully see. And now you see it, Marcus said. No, I see it, she said. All of it. There was a knock at the back room door. It was Rosa from the kitchen. She came in with a tray of food that nobody had asked for and set it on the edge of the table, the way she set everything down efficiently and without comment. But she paused before she left, which was unusual for Rosa, who did not pause. She looked at Emily. My husband was a member, she said, before he passed. He knew your father. She held Emily's eyes for a moment. He used to say Ghost was the kind of man who made everyone around him better just by being in the room. She stopped. I thought you should know someone said that about him. Emily held Rosa's gaze and said, thank you. Rosa nodded once and left. The room had that quality again, the one it kept returning to, where the weight of what they were doing pressed against the weight of why they were doing it, and the two forces created something that felt like pressure and purpose simultaneously. Marcus picked up a piece of food from the tray and ate it standing up because his body had finally registered that it had been running on coffee and adrenaline for 12 hours. Around the table, others did the same. Emily did not eat. She was looking at the chain. What are you thinking? But Marcus asked her. She looked up. I'm thinking about the other 4 families, she said. The other businesses, the other people who tried to fight this and ran out of resources. She put her hand on the chain. When we advance this motion, is there any possibility of reaching back to those cases? Patricia, who had returned from the courthouse and was now sitting at the end of the table, said, if we establish the fraudulent pattern as part of this case, yes. Each previous case could potentially be reopened depending on the statute of limitations in the specific circumstances. She paused. It is ambitious. Is it possible? Emily pressed. It's possible, Patricia said carefully. It would require significantly more resources and time than the immediate matter. But it's possible. Yes. Emily nodded. She wasn't making a decision out loud. She was filing it, marking it as something she intended to return to. Marcus could see the process of it in her face, the organized, deliberate quality of a person who had learned to manage a complicated situation by separating the immediate from the eventual and addressing them in the correct sequence. Ethan had been exactly the same way. The certified letter to Carla D'Souza went out at 5 in the afternoon. Patricia's paralegal sent a simultaneous email to the address on file with Whitmore and Associates. They had constructed the letter carefully, Emily and Patricia together, drafting it through 4 revisions until it said precisely what needed to be said, without threatening, without implying, without doing anything that could be characterized as improper pressure on a potential witness. It said that a motion had been filed in the Walker estate matter. It said that certain documentation had come to light regarding the history of the case. It said that they were interested in speaking with anyone who might provide context regarding the transfer of files from Gerald Fenn's estate to the current firm. And it said in the final paragraph that they understood this was a sensitive matter and that they were prepared to ensure that anyone who came forward with information in good faith would be properly protected. Emily had written that last paragraph herself. Patricia had read it and said, this is very good. Emily had said, I've been thinking about what I would have needed someone to say to me 5 years ago to make me talk. At 6:40 in the evening, Patricia's office received a reply email. It was from a personal email address, not Whitmore and Associates. The name on the account was C. D'Souza. The message was 4 sentences. I have been waiting for someone to file that motion for 4 years. I can be available tomorrow morning. I will not meet at your office or anywhere connected to either party. I will send a location. Patricia read it aloud to the room. The silence afterward was the silence of a door opening. Emily looked at Marcus across the table, and Marcus looked back at her, and what passed between them in that moment was not words. It was the recognition that something Ethan Walker had built 5 years ago, built in the months before his death, with the full knowledge of what was coming and the full intention of giving his daughter the tools to fight it, was finally beginning to work exactly the way he had designed it to work. Danny said, she's been sitting on this for 4 years. She was waiting for someone to move first, Emily said. She needed to know she wasn't going to be the only person standing in front of whatever comes next. She's not, Marcus said. He meant it for D'Souza. Emily heard it for herself. The next morning arrived with the particular quiet of a day that knows something is going to happen in it. Marcus was up before 5, which was not unusual. Hector arrived at Iron Horse at 5:30. Patricia came at 6 with her paralegal and a recorder and a legal pad she intended to fill. D'Souza's email with the location had come through at 10:30 the previous night. A diner in Tempe, a small independent place that was not connected to anyone relevant and was public enough that everyone would feel safe and private enough that a conversation could be had without the wrong ears nearby. Neutral ground chosen by someone who had been thinking about neutral ground for a long time. Emily got dressed and came downstairs at 6:15. She was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing for 2 days because everything she owned was still in the bag in her car, and she had not thought to get the bag until this moment. She stood in the main bar looking down at herself for a second with an expression that was almost funny, given the circumstances, the smallest human problem, in the middle of the largest situation she had ever navigated. Rosa appeared from the kitchen with a folded shirt. "It's clean," Rosa said. "It'll fit well enough." Emily took it. She looked at Rosa for a moment. Rosa said, "Go get ready. You don't have time to be sentimental." Emily almost smiled. She took the shirt and went back upstairs. Hector said to Marcus very quietly, "She's going to be okay." "I know," Marcus said. "She was always going to be okay," Hector said. "She just needed to stop being okay alone." Marcus thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "That's true of most people." They arrived at the diner in Tempe at 7:50. Patricia went in first with her paralegal. Marcus and Hector waited outside, which was the arrangement Emily had insisted on. D'Souza had agreed to speak with Emily and Patricia. She had not agreed to speak with anyone else, and Emily had been emphatic that they honor exactly what D'Souza had agreed to, nothing more and nothing less, because a woman who had been sitting on a secret for 4 years needed to feel that the people she was trusting were exactly as trustworthy as they presented themselves. Emily went in last. She left the chain in Marcus's truck. She walked into the diner carrying nothing but the folded letter her father had written. Carla D'Souza was already seated in a booth near the back. She was in her early 40s, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who had prepared deliberately for this meeting with the particular quality of self-containment that Marcus had recognized in Emily, that specific tension between fear and resolution, between the desire to run and the decision to stay. She looked up when Emily sat down across from her. She looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You look like him. I only saw one photograph in the files, but you look like him." Emily said, "I've been told that." Patricia set her recorder on the table. D'Souza looked at it, looked at Patricia. Then she reached into her bag and set a thick manila folder on the table between them. "I have been carrying this in my car for 3 years, D'Souza said, because I didn't know where to bring it and I was afraid to leave it at home." She looked at Emily. "This is everything Fenn had on the Walker estate matter. The original documents, the legal pad notes from his client visits, and a memo he wrote to his own file 11 days before he died." Emily looked at the folder. She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at D'Souza and said, "Why didn't you advance the motion?" D'Souza was quiet for a moment. "Because 3 months after I inherited the files, a man came to see me at the office. He was very calm and very clear. He said that the Walker matter was a settled situation and that advancing it would create complications that would be harmful to everyone involved. He used that word harmful in a way that did not mean professionally harmful." She stopped. "I had a daughter who was 7 years old. I chose to stay quiet." "And then you moved to Whitmore and Associates," Emily said. "I thought if I was inside the firm, I could understand what I was dealing with. I thought proximity would give me information." D'Souza's hands were flat on the table. "What it gave me instead was 4 years of knowing exactly how these people operated and being unable to do anything about it, because every time I thought about moving, I thought about the way that man said the word harmful." Emily looked at her steadily. "What changed?" "Your letter," D'Souza said simply. "When I saw that the motion had been filed, I understood that something had shifted, that someone had found the thread and was pulling it." She paused. "And when I saw your name on the filing, I understood who had pulled it." She looked at Emily with an expression that was difficult to categorize because it was made up of too many things. "He used to talk about you, Fenn, in his notes. He called you his primary motivation for making the documentation bulletproof. He wrote in the memo you're about to read that whatever happened to him, the filing had to be enough to protect the girl. The table was very quiet. Emily reached out and put her hand on the manila folder. She did not open it yet. She said he was right, it was enough. D'Souza nodded. She reached up and pressed two fingers to her eyes briefly, a gesture so human and so small in the middle of everything that it had more weight than any statement she could have made. Patricia said gently, Miss D'Souza, I'd like to begin taking your statement when you're ready. D'Souza lowered her hand. She straightened in her seat. I've been ready for 4 years, she said. I was just waiting for someone else to go first. Outside the diner, Marcus was sitting on the tailgate of his truck with Hector beside him, and he was thinking about Ethan, which was becoming something close to a constant state. He was thinking about the memo in that folder, the one written 11 days before Gerald Fenn died, the one that said whatever happens to him, the filing has to be enough to protect the girl. Two men who had never met working 5 years apart, both of them choosing to build something rather than run from something, both of them putting their specific piece of protection in place and trusting that eventually someone would come along and connect the pieces. Hector said, How long do you think they'll be in there? However long it takes, Marcus said. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know Pritchard and Coyle are going to fight this. I know. This is going to get loud before it gets quiet. I know that too. And the people inside the county system, we'll deal with them, Marcus said. One problem at a time. Hector looked at the diner. She's something stone, the girl. Marcus thought about the chain looped on the floor of his truck. He thought about the scraping sound it had made crossing the Iron Horse floor 2 nights ago, the sound that had silenced 300 people who had thought they had heard everything. He thought about what it takes to walk into a room like that alone at 20, carrying nothing but a dead man's chain and a letter, and 5 years of refusal to accept that the wrong people get to win. She's exactly what Ethan said she was, Marcus replied. The door of the diner opened. Emily came out first. She was holding the manila folder. Her face was not the face of someone who had just finished something. It was the face of someone who had just loaded something. The distinction was visible from 20 feet away if you knew how to look, and Marcus knew how to look. She walked to the truck and held up the folder. Fenn's original notes, she said. D'Souza's full statement on record, and something nobody knew about except Fenn. She opened the folder and extracted a single document from the top. Fenn had a backup attorney, someone he trusted outside the Phoenix area. He mailed copies of everything to this person 2 days before the accident. The backup attorney has been holding them for 5 years, waiting for contact from the estate. Marcus stared at her. He built a redundancy, he said. He built a redundancy, Emily confirmed, because he knew his files might not survive. She handed Marcus the document. On it was a name and an address. An attorney in Tucson who had been sitting on copies of everything, copies of the motion, copies of the legal pad notes, copies of the memo for 5 years. Waiting. The way Carl had been waiting. The way D'Souza, in her own terrified way, had been waiting. Ethan had known. He had built a protection so layered that 5 years of opposition, of silence, of intimidation of shell companies and convenient accidents had not been enough to dismantle it. He had understood the enemy clearly enough to design against their every move. And then he had trusted that eventually someone would come along and use what he had built. Marcus looked at the document. He looked at Emily. Your father, he said, and then he stopped because some things were too large for the sentences that usually carried them. Emily looked at him with eyes that were clear and full and certain. I know, she said. She tucked the document back into the folder. She looked at Hector and said, Get Patricia. We need to call Tucson. Hector was already moving. And Marcus Stone Callahan, 55 years old, 30 years of road behind him, and more roads still to come, sat on the tailgate of his truck, holding a document that proved a dead man had outmaneuvered people who thought they had won, and he felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since the moment he saw the name Ghost on a vest being dragged across his floor. The unsettled thing was grief. What settled in its place was something a great deal like pride. The attorney in Tucson was named Bernard Okafor, and he answered his phone on the first ring. Patricia made the call from the parking lot of the diner in Tempe, while Emily stood 3 feet away, listening to the one side of the conversation she could hear. Marcus stayed near the truck. He was giving Emily space the way he had learned in the past 48 hours that she sometimes needed space not because she was withdrawing, but because she was concentrating, pulling everything inward to a single point of focus the way her father used to do before he made a decision that mattered. Patricia said, "Mr. Okafor, my name is Patricia Solano. I represent the Walker estate in a probate matter filed in Maricopa County. I believe you may be holding documents relevant to that matter." There was a pause, then Patricia's expression changed, not dramatically. Just a slight shift around the eyes, the specific shift of someone receiving information that confirms something they had believed but hadn't been certain of until this moment. She said, yes, we can be there this afternoon." She hung up. She looked at Emily. "He said," Patricia began, and then she stopped for a second, which was unusual because Patricia Solano did not typically stop. "He said he had been waiting for this call for 4 years. He said Gerald Fenn told him the call would come eventually, that he should keep the documents somewhere safe, and when someone contacted him about the Walker estate, to make sure they were who they said they were before he handed anything over." Emily said, "How did he verify us?" "He asked me to describe the chain," Patricia said. The parking lot went quiet. Emily absorbed that. She absorbed it with her eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds. And when she opened them, they were bright in a way that was not tears and was not tears either, but was something in the specific territory between the two that doesn't have a clean name. "Fenn knew about the chain," she said. "Your father told him," Patricia said quietly. "He told him that if anyone came claiming to represent his daughter's estate, they would know about the chain. He said it was the one thing that couldn't be fabricated." Marcus heard that from where he was standing, and he turned away for a moment and looked at nothing in particular and breathed slowly, because that was the thing that broke through the controlled professional exterior he had been maintaining for 2 days. Not the fraud, not the shell companies, not Roy Stoller's name on a police report, not even they know written on a whiteboard. The image of Ethan Walker explaining to his attorney that the verification for everything he had built would be a motorcycle chain, because it was the one thing no one else would know to mention. A man who was dying had thought of everything. They drove to Tucson that afternoon. Patricia and her paralegal in one car. Emily with Marcus and Hector in the truck. The drive was 2 hours, and for most of it nobody talked, which was the right choice. There was too much to process for conversation to be useful. Marcus drove. Emily sat in the passenger seat with the manila folder on her lap and Fenn's documents inside it, and at some point around the halfway mark, she fell asleep, which told Marcus more about the level of exhaustion she had been running on than anything she had said directly. She slept with her hand resting on the folder. Hector from the back seat said very quietly, "She trusts us." "Yeah," Marcus said. "She didn't when she walked in 2 nights ago." "No, she didn't. Your father would have handled this the same way you did," Hector said, which was the highest compliment Hector was capable of giving, and both of them knew it. Marcus said nothing. He kept driving. Emily woke up about 20 minutes outside Tucson. She blinked, oriented herself, looked down at the folder. Then she looked out the window at the desert moving past and said without any preamble, "I used to think the hardest part was being alone." Marcus glanced at her. "But the hardest part wasn't being alone," she said. "The hardest part was knowing my father had prepared everything perfectly and still losing." She paused. "It felt like preparation wasn't enough, like it didn't matter how carefully you did things." "And now," Marcus said. She looked at the folder. "Now I think I understand what he was actually doing. He wasn't trying to prevent them from taking the business. He couldn't prevent that. He knew he was dying, and he knew they were organized, and he knew that a 15-year-old girl couldn't fight that alone, no matter how well he prepared the legal documents." She stopped. "What he was doing was building something that would still be there when I was old enough and strong enough to use it. I was making sure that when I finally showed up, ready to fight, the weapons were already in place." Marcus said, "He trusted you to get there." "He trusted me to get there," Emily confirmed, "even when I didn't trust myself." Bernard Okafor's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Tucson that had the worn, settled quality of a place that had been doing real work for a long time. Okafor himself was a tall man in his late 50s with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that the most important things rarely benefited from rushing. He shook hands with Patricia first, then with Emily, and when he shook Emily's hand, he held it a moment longer than a standard handshake and looked at her with an expression that was careful and kind simultaneously. "You look like the photograph he showed me," he said. Emily said, He showed you a photograph. He brought it to our first meeting, Okafor said. He said it was important to him that I understood who I was holding these documents for. He released her hand. He said she'll come when she's ready. Don't rush her and don't doubt her. Something crossed Emily's face that she controlled almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. They sat down at Okafor's conference table. He opened a fireproof document safe behind his desk and removed a sealed accordion folder. The seal had the date of Fenn's death written on it in marker. He set it on the table. I have not opened this since Gerald sealed it, Okafor said. Those were my instructions, to hold it sealed until someone representing the Walker estate contacted me. He looked at Emily. Would you like to do the honors? Emily reached across the table. She broke the seal. Inside was everything Fenn had built. The original trust documents in clean, complete form, with the legal pad notes from both his visits to the shop, 37 pages of detailed observations and factual records covering every element of the business structure. The memo to file written 11 days before the accident, laying out with clinical precision the exact legal argument that would make any debt claim against the restructured entity indefensible. And beneath all of that, a single sealed envelope with Emily's name written on it in handwriting she did not recognize. She picked up the envelope. She looked at Okafor. Fenn wrote it the day before he died, Okafor said quietly. He gave it to me with the folder. He said if his client's daughter ever opened this safe, she deserved to have a word from the man who was trying to protect her. The room was very still. Emily opened the envelope. She read it once without speaking. Then she set it, face it down on the table, and put both hands flat on the surface, and stayed that way for about 10 seconds, with her head slightly bowed, and nobody said anything, because the room had the quality of a space where something sacred was happening, and interrupting it would have been a specific kind of wrong. When she looked up, her eyes were clear. He says he's sorry he didn't get to finish, she said. Her voice was steady. He says the filing will hold. He says she should find people she trusts and let them help her, because the biggest mistake people make in hard situations is believing they have to carry everything alone. She stopped. He says her father was the most careful, most loving man he had ever worked with in 30 years of practice, and that the work they did together was some of the most important work of his career. Patricia, who was not a sentimental person by professional training, set down her pen. Okafor had his hands folded on the table. Marcus, who was standing near the door because the room was small, looked at the wall. Emily picked the letter back up and folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket next to her father's letter. And when she looked around the table, her expression had completed some transition that Marcus had been watching build across 2 days, from the exhausted, controlled wariness of someone who had been surviving alone for too long to something that was fully unguardedly present. She said, "Let's finish this." The next 3 weeks were the most complex legal and investigative work Marcus had ever been adjacent to, and he had been adjacent to some complex situations in 30 years. Patricia filed in Maricopa County, and in coordination with Okafor, filed supporting documentation in Pima County. Reese compiled the full financial map of Pritchard & Coyle's operation across 3 states and turned it over to a federal contact he had maintained from his bank examiner years, someone who had the authority and jurisdiction to look at what Reese had found and recognize it for what it was. D'Souza's statement went to that same federal contact. So did the police report on Gerald Fenn's accident, along with a detailed memo Reese had prepared documenting Roy Stoller's employment history and his specific connection to the investigation that had cleared the accident as a straightforward, distracted driving incident. Pritchard & Coyle retained 3 separate attorneys in the first week after the motion was filed. All 3 were from firms that had no connection to Whitmore & Associates, which meant they understood what had already been compromised and were trying to construct a clean defense at a late stage. Their first move was a motion to dismiss on procedural grounds, exactly as Patricia had predicted. Patricia's response was so thoroughly documented and so precisely argued that the dismissal motion was denied within 72 hours, which was fast enough to make it clear to everyone involved that the bench was paying attention to this case. Their second move was a settlement offer. It arrived through one of the new attorneys delivered to Patricia's office in a sealed envelope, and it contained a number that was significant and an attached non-disclosure agreement that was 23 pages long. Patricia brought it to Emily. Emily read the non-disclosure agreement once top to bottom. Then she set it on the table and looked at Patricia. "If I sign this," Emily said, "what happens to the other families?" Patricia said carefully. The settlement would be specific to the Walker estate matter. Other cases would not be affected by your agreement. But my participation in those cases would be affected. Yes, the NDA is broad enough to effectively prevent you from serving as a witness or providing support in any subsequent action related to Pritchard and Coyle. Emily looked at the settlement number. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was more money than she had imagined being offered. It was the kind of number that could give her back everything that had been taken and then significantly more, and it was sitting in front of her with a pen beside it. She pushed it back across the table. No, she said. Patricia said, Emily. No, Emily said again, not loudly, not dramatically, with the flat, complete certainty of someone who had already worked through the calculation before the offer arrived. There are 4 other families. There may be more. Accepting this money and signing that agreement means every one of them stays exactly where I was 3 weeks ago. No support, no access to what we've found, no path forward. She looked at Patricia directly. I am not doing to them what was done to me. Patricia studied her for a moment. Then she said, I'll inform opposing counsel that the offer has been declined. She picked up her phone. Emily stood up and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the city. Marcus, who had been in the corner chair, watched her. He thought about what it cost a person who had been poor and frightened and alone for 5 years to look at a significant sum of money and push it away. He thought about the specific quality of principle required to do that, the kind that was not performance and was not ideology, but was simply the internalized understanding that there were things you did not do regardless of what doing them was worth. I thought about Ethan, he said quietly. Your father would have made the same choice. She turned from the window. I know, she said. That's how I knew it was the right one. The federal investigation moved faster than state matters typically moved, which suggested that what Reese had provided to his contact was significant enough to warrant priority. Within 2 weeks, Pritchard and Coyle's business accounts were frozen pending investigation. The Shell LLC executing the purchase of Ethan's building had the transaction halted by court order. Whitmore and Associates received a formal inquiry that prompted 3 of their senior partners to retain personal counsel, which is the specific legal maneuver that means people inside a firm have decided that the firm's interests and their own interests are no longer identical. Roy Stoller's connection to the Fenn investigation was referred to the State Attorney General's office. Carl Briggs, who was recovering from his broken ribs and his broken arm, in the way that men of his particular generation recovered from things, which was stubbornly and without complaining to anyone who asked, provided a recorded statement from his hospital bed that added the element of witness intimidation to a case that was already substantial. The third attorney Pritchard had retained withdrew from representation in the middle of the 3rd week. That was the moment Marcus understood they had won. Not the legal conclusion, which was still working its way through several different courts and jurisdictions and would continue to do so for months. But the essential thing, the thing that mattered, was decided the moment their own attorney decided the situation was too damaged to be worth his professional reputation, Marcus told Emily. She was sitting at the table in the Iron Horse back room, which had become a kind of working headquarters over the past 3 weeks. The chain was on the wall. Marcus had asked her early in the 2nd week if she wanted it back, or if she was all right with him hanging it there, and she had looked at it for a moment and said, put it up. He had hung it himself on a hook between the window and the memorial board, where the chapter kept the names of fallen brothers. It looked exactly right there. Pritchard's attorney withdrew a cert, Marcus told her. Emily looked up from the documents she had been reviewing. She took that in. She nodded. How long until the building question is resolved? She asked. Patricia thinks the hold becomes permanent within 60 days, Marcus said. After that, the property reverts to the estate, which means it reverts to you. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't know what to do with the building. Marcus sat down across from her. What did your father do with it? He ran a small engine repair shop. Is that something you could do? She looked at him. I don't know how to repair small engines. Carl Briggs does, Marcus said, and he's going to need something to do when he gets out of that hospital. Emily stared at him. Then something happened in her face that had not happened in the 2.5 weeks she had been living and working out of Iron Horse Tavern. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a controlled social response, but a real one, sudden and genuine and brief. The laugh of someone who has been holding something very tight for a very long time and just felt it release by 1 degree. You want me to ask a 60-something retired mechanic with a broken arm to go back to work, she said. I want you to consider the possibility, Marcus said, that Carl Briggs has been waiting 5 years for someone to give him a reason to go back into that building, and that the person capable of giving him that reason is you. Emily looked at the chain on the wall. She looked at her father's name on the memorial board, ghost carved there 5 years ago by men who had intended to honor him and had Marcus now understood only done half the job. The name on the building, Emily said slowly. When I drove up to it, the sign still said Walker's Small Engine Repair. She paused. They changed it eventually. It's Phoenix Power Equipment now. What would you put on the sign? Marcus asked. She thought about it. Walker's, she said. Just Walker's. Marcus nodded. That's a good name. The formal resolution of the Maricopa County probate matter came 51 days later. Patricia called Emily at 7 in the morning with the news, and Emily was already awake because she had not been sleeping late in the weeks since all of this began, her internal clock having apparently decided that early mornings were the correct time to be alert and prepared for whatever the day required. The motion Fenn had filed 5 years ago was upheld. The debt claim was ruled invalid as applied to the restructured business entity. The property and associated business assets were restored to the Walker estate. Pritchard and Coyle, who were by that point the subjects of a federal investigation that had expanded to encompass all 3 states in a preliminary count of 9 fraudulent acquisitions, did not contest the ruling. Patricia also told Emily that 2 of the 4 other families whose businesses had been taken had been contacted by the federal investigators and were being offered paths to restitution as part of the broader case. Emily stood in the Iron Horse parking lot listening to Patricia deliver all of this in the precise, organized way. Patricia delivered everything. And when Patricia finished, Emily said, "Thank you for everything." Patricia said, "Your father was right about you." Emily said, "You never met my father. He consulted me once about his business structure," Patricia said. "And he told me that day that the most important thing he was doing is not the legal documents. He said the most important thing was making sure that when his daughter came up against something too large for one person to handle, she would know that asking for help was not the same as giving up." She paused. It appears he was correct. Emily was quiet for a moment. "I was usually correct," she said. The gathering at Iron Horse that weekend was not planned as a formal event. Word went out the way a word had always gone out through the chapter and beyond it, and people came the way they came when something mattered. Writers from the Phoenix chapter and the Nevada chapter and 2 chapters in New Mexico who had received Reese's documentation and understood what the investigation meant for their territories. People who had ridden with Ethan Walker in the years before he got sick. People who had not known him personally but who had heard the story of the chain scraping across the floor 3 weeks ago and had understood instinctively what it meant. Carl Briggs came. His arm was still in a cast, and he was moving carefully, but he came. Rosa put him at a table near the bar and kept bringing him food he didn't ask for, and he ate all of it because Rosa had a quality that made refusing her food feel like poor manners. Okafor drove up from Tucson. Even D'Souza came, which surprised Marcus, though perhaps it shouldn't have. She came alone, and she was clearly uncertain about the welcome she would receive, standing in the doorway of Iron Horse with the careful posture of someone who understood that the room had complicated feelings about her history. She had carried the documents for 4 years. She had also stayed silent for 4 years. Emily saw her in the doorway. She crossed the room and extended her hand. D'Souza shook it. Emily said, "You came first in the end." D'Souza said, "I should have come sooner." "Yes," Emily said, "but you came." She brought D'Souza inside, introduced her to Carl, who looked at her for a long moment before he nodded because Carl understood the complicated arithmetic of people who had done imperfect things in frightening circumstances. Introduced her to Patricia, who shook her hand with professionalism and set aside everything else for the evening because the evening was not the time for those conversations. Marcus watched all of this from his corner. He watched the room fill and the conversations layer over each other in the specific warmth of a gathering where something real had been accomplished, settle into the space the way it settled when it was earned. He watched Carl Briggs laugh at something Danny Vega said, a full laugh that clearly hurt his ribs and that he didn't try to suppress. He watched Patricia accepting a beer from someone with the specific surprise of a person not accustomed to accepting beers and deciding it was the right occasion to start. And he watched Emily Walker move through the room. She was not the same person who had scraped a chain across this floor 3 weeks ago. Or rather, she was entirely the same person, but she was that person without the weight that had been compressing her into a smaller shape. She stood differently. She moved differently. She talked to people with a directness that had always been there, but that had previously been pointed inward at whatever problem was directly in front of her, and was now simply the natural quality of a person who knew where she stood. At some point in the evening, Marcus stood up and the room went quiet the way it always went quiet when he stood, because 30 years had established that when Marcus Stone Callahan stood up in Iron Horse, there was usually something worth listening to. He looked around the room. He looked at the chain on the wall. Police said, 5 years ago, we buried a brother. We did the things you do. We showed up to the cemetery. We said his name. We put it on the wall. He paused. And we thought that was enough. The room was completely still. What we learned, Marcus said, is that honoring someone is not a single act. It's not the day of the funeral and the name on the wall and the ride you take in their memory. Honoring someone is what you do for the people they loved and the things they built and the promises they made after the ceremony is over and the road goes quiet, and it would be easy to assume the obligation is complete. He looked at Emily. She looked back at him. 3 weeks ago, a young woman walked into this bar carrying her father's chain because every other door had closed on her. She had spent 5 years doing what her father told her to do, taking every road available, fighting with everything she had, and coming here only when there was nothing left. And what she found when she got here was that her father had left something waiting for her. He paused. Not us, he said. We weren't what he left. What he left was a set of tools, a letter, a chain, a motion filed in a courthouse, a document sealed in an attorney's safe in Tucson. Instructions precise enough to guide a 20-year-old woman through a situation that had defeated grown men with resources and legal training. He looked at the chain. Ethan Ghost Walker spent the last 4 months of his life building something that would outlast him. Not a business, not a name on a wall. He looked at Emily again. He built his daughter a way home. The room held that. Carl Briggs, from his chair by the bar, put his good hand over his eyes briefly. Marcus said, she found her way, and she brought with her enough to help 4 other families find theirs. And she turned down enough money to make most people forget their principles because she decided that her father's name meant something specific, and she was not going to let it mean something less. He picked up his glass. To Ghost, he said, and to the daughter who made sure he won. 300 voices said it back. Emily did not say it with them. She was standing with her glass held looking at the chain on the wall, and her lips were moving slightly in the way lips move when someone is saying something private that isn't meant to be heard. Marcus heard it anyway because he was close and the room was briefly quiet between the toast and the response. She was saying, I got here, Dad. I got here. After the gathering thinned and the bikes rolled out one by one into the Arizona night, Emily sat with Marcus and Carl at the corner table. Carl had his cast arm resting on the table and a cup of coffee Rosa had brought him without asking. Emily had her father's letter in front of her, unfolded, reading it for what was probably the 100th time since she had first opened it 4 months ago. Carl said, you going to fix up the building? Building, Emily folded the letter. Working on it. You're going to need a mechanic, Carl said. Emily looked at him. Your arm is broken. My arm is broken for about 4 more weeks, Carl said. The building question takes longer than 4 weeks to sort. Emily looked at him. Marcus shrugged very slightly, the shrug of a man who has already made his suggestion and is content to let it develop at its own pace. Emily looked back at Carl. I don't know how to run a business, she said. Your father didn't either when he started, Carl said. He figured it out. He had more time than I do. You have more help than he did, Carl said simply. The simplicity of it landed the way simple, true things land. Emily looked at the chain on the wall. She had been looking at it all evening, returning to it the way you return to something that has been the center of gravity in your life for a long time and is now becoming something else. Not less important, but differently important. The way a compass becomes less essential once you've found the direction and started walking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he wrote in the letter that when I found the people he sent me to find, I would understand why he trusted them. And Marcus said, she looked at him steadily. I understand, she said. Carl reached across the table with his good hand and put it over Emily's the way he had done at the hospital, the gesture of a man who had known her father and who understood that some things couldn't be expressed any other way. Emily turned her hand and held his for a moment. Outside, the last few bikes were pulling out. The sound of their engines moved through the night in the way that sound always moved out of Iron Horse, out into the desert, in the darkness, in the long flat roads that connected one corner of this life to another. Marcus looked at the chain. I thought about the night it had scraped across his floor and silenced 300 men. He thought about Ethan Walker, who had spent his last 4 months building something instead of grieving, who had trusted his daughter to survive 5 years alone because he knew she had what it took, and he trusted the people he had chosen to be waiting at the end of it. He thought about the families who had a path forward now. He thought about Carl, who would be back in that building in 5 weeks with his cast-off and his tools out, rebuilding something that should never have been taken. He thought about Patricia, who would never admit how much this case had mattered to her, but whose phone calls had gotten longer and less formal over the past 3 weeks in a way that said everything. I thought about the 2 words on Ethan's whiteboard, "They know," and he thought about what Ethan had done with that knowledge, what he had chosen to do in the days and weeks that followed writing those words, the direction he had chosen to face. Not away, toward, always toward. He looked at Emily Walker, 20 years old, sitting at the corner table of Iron Horse Tavern with Carl Briggs's hand in hers and her father's letter folded in her jacket and the whole complicated, hard-won rest of her life in front of her. He looked at her and he saw Ethan in the line of her jaw and the directness of her eyes and the particular quality of stillness that looked like calm even when it was the furthest thing from calm. And he understood with the full settled clarity of a man who has spent 30 years learning the difference between things that matter and things that merely seemed to that Ethan Ghostwalker had not failed his daughter. He had given her everything. He had given her the tools, the protection, the people, the proof, and the patience, and he had trusted her completely to know what to do with all of it when the time came. She had walked through the door of Iron Horse Tavern, dragging a chain across the floor alone, and exhausted and carrying 5 years of refusal to quit. She had walked in alone, and she would never walk alone again.